Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, what's fueling anti-immigrant violence in South Africa? We go beyond the headlines and into the local conversations about the latest attacks. I'm going to say a special hello to our South African viewers. I know many of you are taking part in today's programme. Here's Malika Bilal, our digital producer, explaining how they're doing that, Malika.
Right. Well, they are just some of the people that appear in our panels right here. You take a look at these panels. These are some of the dozens and dozens of comments we've received from community asking for us to cover this show. Read just one of them. This is via Twitter. This person says, "Finally, I've been waiting for this episode. It has to do with clear misconceptions about immigrants and a crippling economic situation." Now, as always, we want your comments on this as well. You can tweet them to us at AJStream.
My name is Al-Qasim Abdulkader. I'm a Nigerian journalist and a security analyst. I am in the stream.
Tensions remain high in South Africa after one of the worst outbreaks of violence against immigrant communities in the last few years. Several people have been killed and thousands have been forced out of their homes as a result of a series of recent attacks. Angry crowds who have looted several foreign-owned stores accuse immigrants from other African countries of taking away their jobs. President Jacob Zuma condemned the violence and assigned a ministerial task team to address this problem. But neighbouring countries like Zimbabwe, Malawi and Mozambique started evacuating their citizens from areas where the attacks took place. So today we want to go beyond the headlines to try to understand why the violence is happening. To help us do that, we're joined by Daniel Jimungo Dunia. He is a Congolese business owner in Durban. His store was looted in the attacks. Khadija Patel is executive editor for the Daily Vox. That's an online publication in Johannesburg. And Jay Naidu is a political and social activist. Jay was a former minister in the late President Mandela's cabinet. I also want to let you know that we asked the South African Minister of Small Business Development to join us, but she pulled out at the last minute. I am very grateful, though, to Jay, Daniel and Khadija for being in this conversation. Daniel, let's start off with you. You've been in the middle of these immigrant attacks in South Africa. What happened to you? Tell us your story.
Actually, what happened is that was on Monday, the 31st of last month. And the team of guys come and singing the song that the king said foreigners must go. And they were carrying knives, stones, and started hitting to our shop. And we had no option is to run. While we're running, we even meet other brothers who was burned alive, killed. We ran, we went back home. But they follow us until in our homes, saying that foreigners must go. They're hitting stones. When the police arrived to disperse them, it wasn't an easy thing. They felt the South African was the one side and the foreigners on one side. So the police have to escort us until to the police station where we sleep for 2 nights. It was a very, very difficult moment for us. And from the police station, they took us to the camp where we are living today.
So you're living in a displaced persons camp, a displaced people's camp. These people who attacked your business, they must have been your neighbours, your customers. Did you have any sense that this was about to happen to you?
Really, we didn't think that something like this can happen to us. Most of them are really South Africans. Our neighbor, taxi rank, the people working in the taxi industry, all the boys around, are the people who really live in the area.
Sure. And you mentioned the Zulu King, or the King. This is the Zulu King. Just have a look back here on my laptop. The Zulu King here says, "The attacks on foreigners are not my fault." This is a story that seems to be part of the latest attacks. Khadija, as you're an executive editor of an online publication, can you explain where the King fits into this? The Zulu King.
So some weeks ago, King Zwelithini was quoted by the media saying, making very derogatory comments about foreigners in South Africa. He, said that basically said that foreigners, are something like lice, and they need to be, they need to leave South Africa. He blamed foreigners for the scourge of unemployment and really all ills in South Africa. So this this statement was made very much in the middle of great tensions in Durban.
Right.
We believe, when when we look back at what happened, it seems, I mean, the spark really does not seem to have been the king, really, but a somewhat of a labor dispute at a wholesaler in Isipingo. But the tensions and the fact that these sentiments exist and then they are sparked by certain statements means that from this one labor dispute, it seems to have spread throughout Durban, and as Daniel points out, crowds were chanting things like "the king has spoken." So while the king, can put his hands up and say, "This has nothing to do with me. I never said, I never sent people out to do this." The fact is that the way people interpreted what he said, it remains a different story, and he has to take some responsibility for that. Then he's refused to take any responsibility for it,
right.
But he has now come out yesterday saying, that he believes that it's the duty of all South Africans to protect foreigners.
Femi, if people are following along on our app at home, they'll know that because of the attacks that Khadija was just talking about, people have been fleeing from this sort of violence within South Africa, up to 5,000 people. And so from within our community, we're hearing things like this. This is Daidi, who says, "The relationship is always tense. Since 2008, we've been living in a constant state of fear." So Jay, I want to go to you with this because you're from Durban. What is the atmosphere and the environment like that people have this sense of fear and have had it for so long?
Well, if we have to look at violence, understand that we come from a very violent past. And although 1994 saw a political miracle, we still have not addressed the legacy of that violence. South Africa remains a violent country. Look at the issue rape against women, gender violence, criminal violence. And I think violence is actually a language that we have to come to terms with. And given the situation where, South Africa is today one of the most unequal countries in the world, there's growing poverty, joblessness, and an ugly head of corruption that is rising in a country that is rich enough to provide basic services to all people. And that crisis is what's a deep anger in our townships and in our squatter camps. And when there's competition over scarce resources, you just need some xenophobic opportunism to provide the spark that basically ignites the type of looting and vandalism and the humanitarian crisis we face today. So part of it is dealing with things that come from our past as well as things that come from our present.
Daniel, how long have you lived in South Africa?
I've been in South Africa since 2006. It's around 10 years I'm in South Africa.
So 10 years in South Africa. So you're basically a local. I mean, this is your home. Do you feel at home? Do people make you feel at home, or do they make you feel like you're an outsider?
Honestly speaking, I don't feel like being at home at all.
Because why? Why?
Because what
someone's phoning you to tell you, "Hey, Daniel, do you know you're on Al Jazeera?" Yes, stop phoning him. All right. So you don't feel at home because why? 10 years is a long time. That's enough to feel comfortable. What do people say to you?
What makes me to not feel at home is the way South Africans are treating foreigners. Even at Home Affairs itself, the way they treat us is something we can't understand. The way they kill our brothers and burn them alive. You can't feel at home the place where a human being become a bride meat.
Is it jealousy, Khadija? I'm trying to make sense of this, and you're there, and we're watching as an international community, seeing this, and as outsiders, we're seeing all these Africans together. It's like, why are they fighting each other? So what is it within South Africa that's making this happen? Jay gave us his take. Is it jealousy?
Femi, it is very complex, and I think that it differs from community to community. But in certain places, certainly jealousy does play play a role as well, especially when really it's competition between businesses. So we're seeing this, we're talking about this recent spate of violence that began around the end of March, but we also had another wave of violence in January in Soweto, where we saw similar scenes, and of looting and basically pillaging the the businesses and homes of foreign nationals in Soweto and other neighboring townships. And going back there, when things calmed down, and listening to people's grievances there, and actually asking looters, people who readily admit to participating in looting, so why did you do this? And they tell us, well, they now own all the shops, and our people can't open shops. So that, in certain places, there certainly is that, that element. I wouldn't call it jealousy per se, but there definitely is competition for the resources of the community. And when you believe it,
Khadija, you're sort of echoing what Jay says. So there's competition. Why do you go to your local store that Daniel is running and then burn it down? Why would you do that to your neighbour?
Femi, let me answer part of that. It is not unusual for people to use violence to wipe out their debts that they owe. So some of it is driven by personal greed that, in the time of the past when we fought against apartheid, there were people who were labeled informers, and that label meant you died. And so you could deal with family feuds, you could deal with business debts in that way. So I think that part of that we have of understanding xenophobia is the fact that 1 in 4 Africans goes to bed hungry today. 1 in 3 South Africans lives on a social ground. 1 in 4 South Africans is unemployed. And in that context, you find that there is this major battle that takes place over housing, over jobs, over people being, homes. And people find that it's to find a scapegoat and say, well, my problems are caused by someone who is different, that can be identified, rather than dealing with the crisis of delivery, which is about government doing its job. We are a rich country. We should not have the levels of unemployment and poverty that we have today in South Africa.
Well, Jay and Khadija, you're mentioning the grievances, so I want to put one more in the mix. This is from a fellow South African on Facebook. She writes to us, most enter our country illegally. They buy South African identity documents. They use our clinics, our schools. They take job opportunities. She continues here saying, I will never condone violence, but please convince your citizens to go home and give those who suffered under apartheid a chance to build lives now that they live in a democracy. So, Khadija, can you talk about the idea and the grievance, really, of illegal immigration?
So that is a very typical response from a xenophobic South African, I would say. There is a sense that foreigners are coming here, they are sponging off our resources, they're stealing, what little opportunity there is for economic upliftment. And more than that, there seems to be a lot of stress now on the notion that certain immigrants are legal and certain are illegal. And the extent of corruption and the perception of corruption in the Department of Home Affairs means that certain South Africans believe that most immigrants here have entered the country illegally, that they are living here illegally, and thus, are actually not entitled to be here at all. So these are the kind of sentiments that is driving this violence. While it's quite all right to say, yes, I believe this, but I also don't condone the violence. This is happening. This is exactly the kind of sentiment that's driving it. Jay?
On that point, there are millions of Africans and people from around the world that are in South Africa illegally. That is a reality that we have. So what we do need is a coherent immigration policy that protects the rights of people who are refugees, political refugees that are fleeing from conflicts in the rest of Africa. We must do, and we must implement that as part of the human rights traditions that our Constitution is. The second part is that we do need to deal with xenophobia today. Nothing can justify killing and looting of foreigners in South Africa. And that needs a political response. I'm extremely disappointed that the minister or someone from government is not in this program. This is a global challenge. Our reputation is lying in tatters, and we should be on every channel unconditionally condemning xenophobic attacks, because this is what is wrong with us, because our response is not strong enough, and it's not coming from across the political spectrum to focus on the real issues that are driving this violence.
See, Daniel, as Malika brought up that comment about immigration, I just caught you at the corner of my eye shaking your head and smiling ruefully. What was behind that gesture as you were listening to the "we have an immigration issue in South Africa"? Your response would be what?
My response is that most of the foreigners are not illegal. No one is illegal. Most of the foreigners are refugees in South Africa. And the issue of saying that the refugees are stealing jobs, I disagree with it, because most of the refugees, they're creating their own jobs, their own bosses. I will tell you, for example, ours in Ispingo, we got like 1,080 people in the camp. And among the 1,080 people in the camp, more than 900, they are their own bosses. They got their own businesses. No one is stealing jobs. And most of them are refugees from the country where there's a war. They flew from Malawi. They are on passport. They got the passport and they got visas. So saying that most of the refugees are illegal, I don't agree with it. And I feel like just the way of chasing the foreigners away and make them to be criminals while they are not criminals.
There's a couple of things I'm seeing here. Have a look here on my laptop, a couple of headlines that I'm seeing here. Nigeria to begin evacuating citizens from Durban, Johannesburg, other cities as death toll rises. And then we've got here, first batch of Zimbabweans fleeing xenophobia arrive back home. So immigrants in South Africa, Daniel, they're leaving South Africa. Is that a solution, just to get out of South Africa? What would you, if you were able to advise the current administration, what would you tell them that legal immigrants in South Africa, what do they need?
The first thing is that the policy regarding migration is not the clear policies. And two, there's no other option what foreigners can do is to leave South Africa, because there is no way. Now is a month, the government, they are saying, we will put people back to the community, but they are not doing it. The king, he waited for full months after people dying, and now he can come and say, it's not my fault. Right. You can see that behind that, the feeling is that they want foreigners to go. And now there's thousands and thousands of foreigners are preparing to leave South Africa. And those who are coming from the country where there's a war, like myself, we are prepared to go to another country than staying in South Africa. Because we are really disappointed. In 2008, there was a xenophobia attack to us. And the government apologized and said, this will never happen again. But this thing is still happening. And you can see even the intervention from the police. It doesn't look like really they want foreigners to be in this country. I attended the scene in Umlazi, where the police was called out to come and intervene, where they're looting a shop of a Somalian brother. When I reached there, they intervened. And when they went aside, they're saying foreigners must go, man. These people, they don't keep money in the bank. These people, they don't pay tax. We don't want, the police themselves who are supposed to protect us are against the foreigners. And that is the issue which we feel like we are not comfortable to be in South Africa anymore.
You know, we're also hearing, of course, from other Africans in countries surrounding South Africa who are just as angry and upset. I want you to hear this video comment. This is a really impassioned response from someone in Nigeria. Have a listen to this.
As regard to the issue of xenophobia of South Africa, honestly, we are very, very disappointed, because it's very sad for Black Africans to be discriminating against, one another. This is very disappointing. This is not the way forward for Africa. This is very, very bad.
And Jay, we're hearing that time and time again. This is another tweet from someone else who says this represents a collective amnesia, a gross failure to educate this generation on the role that fellow Africans played in the apartheid struggle for South Africans. What do you make of that when you hear this?
I completely agree with that. You know, at the end of the day, even in the most recent times, South Africa is seen as the cradle of humanity. What is our humanity? We need to question ourselves on that. You know, we are all Africans. We are all human beings. And so, you know, I was the general secretary of the largest trade union movement, COSATU, in the history of South Africa. It was the backbone of our struggle against apartheid. The biggest strike in South Africa, the mine workers' strike, which brought 350,000 workers out on strike in 1987, was led by a shaft worker from Lesotho, who was the president of the National Union of Mine Workers. The unions broke the back of faction fighting because migrant labor brought workers from all different countries in Southern Africa, and we built unions. It was because of these workers that came from other countries, that supported our struggle, that participated in our struggle, that we won our rights. We won our workers' rights. We won our political rights. We freed Mandela. So I think for me, it is shocking. My words are much stronger than what I hear you saying.
So President Zuma just recently went to one of the displaced people's camps. These are where a lot of the immigrants who've been under attack, they fled to camps. They're living in really uncomfortable circumstances. This is what President Zuma told some of those immigrants just recently. Have a listen to this.
It is not every South African who's saying you must go away. Not at all. It is a very small number of people who say so.
So this is President Zuma saying it's not every South Africa that has issues with immigrants. He's reminding these immigrants who are now out of their homes and out of their neighborhoods that they do have a place in South Africa. Khadija, how do they have a place in South Africa? How do they get to go home when they've been beaten and driven out of their homes? What happens next?
I think that that's the question that we're all looking to answer over the next few days. What does indeed happen next? Certainly for some, for many foreigners in South Africa, they don't have the option of going home. Hundreds of thousands of Somali, Congolese, Ethiopian refugees, are here because they are, they face huge insecurities back home, and they're here because they're trying to really, protect themselves. To look for, they're here for safety, for security. They don't have that option to go back home. And at the same time, there is still, while, we haven't seen, great reports of violence over the last few days, we're still feeling a lot of panic, a lot of confusion in many communities. We've seen, these hoax, text messages going around that are basically sowing panic and confusion, warning of imminent attacks, and these are basically hoax messages, but they are serving to to scare foreign nationals. At one stage in Joburg last week, we had whole suburbs that were closed down because text messages had gone around saying that an attack is imminent.
Right.
And there was absolutely no truth to this, but it was so widely disseminated. And people are already so afraid after having seen scenes elsewhere that they choose to save themselves instead of questioning where this message is coming from. So we're still seeing the remnants of this. And while government has assured South Africans and assured foreign nationals that they are looking into the source of these messages, and they've given their promise of safety and security, and
so Khadija, still this atmosphere of fear. I'm going to take you all to the poster. So we have Khadija Patel, Jane Naidu, Daniel Jamunga Dania. And we're going to continue this conversation about what's happening in South Africa and the attacks on immigrants who are currently living in South Africa. If you want to be part of that conversation, hashtag AJStream. Malika is waiting to hear from you. Let me just tell you, though, what we're going to be doing on the next AJ Stream, filling the holes of history. We'll discuss how some Dalit activists are using social media to retell stories of the caste once known as the Untouchables. That conversation on the next AJ Stream. But for now, hopefully I will see you online. Stream.aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching. Hello again, this is the Stream's online post show. We've been talking about the reasons behind the recent wave of violence against immigrant communities in South Africa. Khadija, if I had to sort of weigh up the number of South Africans who felt aggressively towards outsiders with the reality of what's really happening down on the ground, where would I be if you were being really honest about how South Africans react to outsiders, to immigrants?
So I'm reluctant to actually put numbers on that.
Yeah, and I don't want numbers, just a sense of where are you as a country?
You know, I think that, you know, what I've been saying also over the last few days is that I want to warn against this tendency to label or, you know, to categorize xenophobic violence as the doings of this mad fringe, because you know, there's almost a racist undertone to some commentaries on xenophobic violence in South Africa, where who seek to categorize this as the doings of of the savage black man, and I want to warn against this simply because surveys that have been undertaken, although it was undertaken in 2006, so it is quite dated.
Really old.
But it gives us,
that's a really old. So that's before even 2008, when this phenomenon of xenophobic violence started, right?
Yeah, but that survey then showed the extent of perception against foreign nationals in South Africa, and the fact that it is more prevalent than we actually believe, that it's not restricted to the townships, that and actually that it's more prevalent among white South Africans than black South Africans. Now, granted that this is quite an old survey, and perceptions must have changed, especially looking at the violence.
I mean, that's really that's not telling me what's happening in 2015. Jay, go ahead.
But I think certainly there are millions of South Africans standing up and saying no to xenophobia.
Definitely. That's a hashtag. There's peace marches. There's so much actually online.
And there are also things at a local level where communities are rising up and saying, not in our townships, not in our name. But what this also reflects is a weakness of organizations. Civic organizations were extremely powerful in the 80s. They have all but collapsed. And if you look at the violence against foreigners, there is continuing violence when people rise up and demand water or toilets or sanitation or better education. They are being smashed largely by the security forces acting as a battering ram. Violence is very much part of our DNA, and that's what we've got to address. The question that we really have to ask ourselves is beyond the humanitarian damage on lives, on goods, on life, and the social and economic costs of that. The challenge that faces South Africa today is about fear. It's about insecurity. It's about a psychosis that cannot be quantified, and it affects every single South African home. And if we want to get to the root of xenophobic violence, we have to get to the root of why are we such a violent society when it comes to women, when it comes to children, when it comes to workers demanding higher wages, when it comes to people in the community demanding water and electricity. I think this is a more complex issue than just dealing with it in a xenophobic silo.
Yeah, and I spent some time in South Africa, so the first time I went many years ago, or I don't know, over 10 years ago, I was shocked to see the amount of security that would be around houses and armed guards around houses, and how often people I would say, have you been broken into yet? Nobody said no, they ever said yes or not yet. And how many women have been attacked. So, and the idea when you get to a traffic light and you're driving late at night, you don't stop, you keep going. There's all of these things that you do as South Africans just to survive daily life. And I think then you put the xenophobic violence into that, and then it actually probably makes more sense, Jay. I understand exactly where you're coming from there. Malika?
Well, of course, people are hearing this conversation and the story of Daniel we started with, and they're hearing it and they're tweeting us in. So this is a live comment we got from AK, who says, my sympathy to Daniel and the likes of him that lost their property, and condolences to his family and the victims' families. So Daniel, you see something like this, you see these condolences coming in online. Is there a message that you have for people who are watching in South Africa?
I got fear to say that when there was a march, when the province organized the march against xenophobia, we walk in the city, and behind us, there was another team of people, other thousands, who marching that foreigners must go. So we found out that those who want foreigners to remain and against xenophobia, and there was those who were supporting xenophobia, and all of us, we march at the same road, some behind, and the police have to intervene. I can tell you, like today, this morning, near to the camp where we are living, South African locals, they come and protest, saying why the government giving us a shelter and giving us food, and they don't have nothing to eat. And you find all those things are the challenges for us. And if they say that we need to integrate foreigners back to their communities, at the moment, it's full month. We don't have a home where to go in the community. We don't have business. So that is the challenge. And you see the action which locals are doing. If they're protecting about the shelter which we are in, where even animals can't live in, how they can allow us to live with them in the community? All those are the challenges which we see, and we feel like we don't have a place in the community anymore. And most of the people, they're just saying, but inside themselves, there's that hatred. I told you the police earlier on. The police, they come to intervene, but deep in their heart, they don't want foreigners. They want the foreigners to go away from their countries. So those are the challenges as we are having in this country.
Daniel, I want to read you something that the President Jacob Zuma said quite recently. It says, "We reiterate our view that South Africans are generally not xenophobic. If they were, we would not have such a high number of foreign nationals who've been successfully integrated into communities all over our country, in towns, cities and villages." And in fact, if you follow the government line, they refuse to call this violence xenophobia. They say it's criminal activity. Is that a problem, not recognising it as being focused on immigrants and that it's just some criminals perpetrating this violence? Do you think you actually have to just admit that there's some parts of South Africa that are just embarrassing and uncomfortable to deal with, and maybe you have to say, yes, maybe we are xenophobic. Some parts of the country does have this issue.
I don't agree with the South African government. When they say it's not xenophobic, I don't agree with them. And if it's criminals, they start at Isipingo and they're spreading all over. Why, if it's just criminals, why the police, they can't maintain order and they stop the criminals to carry on? This is xenophobia, is clear. And the government want to protect the image of the country, which we understand, but they must admit that it's xenophobic attack to the foreigners.
Khadija.
Well, I think if I could just...
Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
If I could just come in on this.
Yeah.
You know, this is not the first time we've had the sense of denialism. If you look at the debacle over HIV/AIDS, for a long time that denialism led to us becoming the epicenter of HIV/AIDS in the country and 3,000 people losing their lives.
Yeah, and let me just remind people that President Thabo Mbeki, you do it very briefly, what President Thabo Mbeki said about the HIV/AIDS issue.
Well, I think that the bottom line was that at the height of HIV/AIDS, before it became an epidemic, political leadership in our country was almost denying it was caused by a virus. And secondly, that people should have a right to ARVs, antiretrovirals. It was because civil society, activists, HIV activists activists and organized and took government to court, demonstrated in the streets, built organizations across the country, and then built international solidarity that we are able to change government policy. And in fact, the present government came in on the basis that it was taking a different policy on HIV/AIDS than the one of the Mbeki government. So the same thing we have to do here. There has been a denial that this violence against foreigners is xenophobia. It is xenophobia. And so now that we are talking from the same hymn book, I want to see the same action that one saw when we took on the HIV/AIDS epidemic, that we go street by street, township by township, slum by slum, employer by employer, and we're saying no to xenophobia.
Jay, are we close?
That to say,
do you know, Jay, it sounds amazing. Daniel is nodding his head. I can't imagine that Khadija is disagreeing with you. But is that going to happen? I have a feeling that we're not going to be done talking about this anytime soon.
I think this is the moment where civil society is facing its moment of truth, where activists like we did in 1976 stood up and said, enough. We have had enough of the injustice and our human dignity being stolen by apartheid. I think today, the activists of today's generation need to stand up and not blame foreigners for not having jobs, or the fact that there's no water or sanitation or electricity, or the schools are failing and there's no textbooks. We have to stand up and demand accountability. My hope that this horrific violence around xenophobia will morph into a movement that demands accountability from our leadership across the political spectrum to act and to ensure that the rights, the constitutional rights of human dignity and social justice that are enshrined in our Constitution are implemented for all people in South Africa, whether you're a foreigner or you're a South African.
Let me just do one final check-in with Malika and the community. Malika.
Well, as Jay was saying, that people need to stand up. Some of them, of course, already are standing up. One of them sent us a video comment, so have a listen to Faith.
I'd just like to say I am deeply saddened by what happened over the last 2 weeks in my country. I'd like the foreign nationals to know that this does not represent the majority of South Africans. Many of us are loving and kind and very welcoming and would like you to come to our country. We're open for business.
Just the thoughts from one person.
Wow. Daniel, what are you going to do next?
My option is that I got even the fear at the moment to live in South Africa. And I can't go back to my country of origin, which is under war. So my option is to look for the third country where I can get protection and security, because the government of South Africa is failing us. We try to be patient, we accept what they say, and what makes me to have a lot of pain is that the king waited until people are burned and die, and now he can come and say what he said. That gives us pain. We feel like we don't have a place in this community.
That's Daniel Jimunga Dania. He is a Congolese business owner who had his business destroyed recently. We also had Khadija Patel, executive editor of the Daily Vox, an online publication, and Jay Naidu is a political and social activist, also a former minister in the late President Madiba's cabinet. Daniel, Khadija, Jay, it's been good to listen to you. I wish it was under better circumstances. Thank you for being part of the stream today. So,
thank you.
You're very welcome. Let's move on. Let me tell you about what we've been doing on the next AJ stream. Filling the holes of history. We discuss how some Dalit activists are using social media to retell stories of the caste once known as the Untouchables. That conversation on the next AJ stream. See you soon.